As a follow-up to my previous video, I want to talk about intervals today. And in order to do that, we've got to really understand the context of intervals within a piece of music. It's pointless to learn these things as arbitrary positions on the fretboard when you have to understand them musically to be able to apply them. So I'm going to take the key of D minor here, and I'm going to use a fourth, or any of the fourths that exist within the key of D minor, and try and start my phrase with them. Anything else I do, I'm going to improvise. So I'm starting the phrase with a fourth and then improvising somewhere else. Sounds something like this. So that is a really interesting way of trying to experiment with an interval, because you can hear there I'm using lots of different fourths within the scale of D minor, and they all sound slightly different. I can do it upwards or downwards, and depending on how I use that, it really helps me think more melodically with my phrasing. But I've got to understand how that sounds. It doesn't matter if I know what a fourth looks like on the fretboard, it matters how it sounds in my head and being able to hear phrases like that. So I can also do that at the end of phrases. So let's say I take the end of the phrase and I end the phrase with a fourth. Same kind of thing. Something like that. I think there are a couple of phrases in there where I didn't do it. But you get the idea of ending with a fourth. That is quite hard to do on the fly. It's a really good practice exercise. I still practice these things today and they still kick my ass. So something to add to your practice routine. So I can then also just try and construct lines that have maybe more fourths in them than I'm normally accustomed to using. So let's try that. Sounds something like that. Lots of fourth ideas in there, and again, quite melodic phrasing, hopefully, to compensate for those bigger interval jumps. And this is a really good way of knowing whether or not you've mastered the art of using that interval in the context of the music you're playing. If you find that exercise really difficult, you're never going to be able to use lines that include a lot of fourths in a good way within your improvisation. So we can take a different interval. Let's take something like a fifth, and let's hear the contrast between using a fifth and using a fourth. So we're starting with a fifth. So completely different sound, maybe a little bit more uplifting to my ears anyway when I do that. But again, this is really nice contrast. If I was potentially able to use both of these in the context of a solo, I've got a lot more real estate to work with, a lot more melodic ideas, and just some more interesting things to do than starting the same way every single time. We could also take that interval and just see what happens if we try and construct lines with lots of fifths in them, as we did before. So. Because that's such a big interval jump, it really contrasts with the scalic work in the middle of that. So two really nice things to play about with there are, just going up and down a scale or using some very scalic ideas of seconds, and then putting some fifths in there seems to really contrast quite nicely, and that's where my ear naturally goes with that. Again, I have to reiterate the point, I am trying to hear this. This is not a fretboard exercise. Like, you are expected to just kind of know where the fretboard stuff is. It's not that hard to learn the fretboard. It's really hard to learn how the notes on the fretboard sound. So just make sure you are thinking of this as an ear training exercise, not as a fretboard one. So that's fourths and fifths. Again, I forgot to say this at the start of this video, it's important to do those things downwards as well as up. So if I'm using fifths, I want to make sure I can start my phrases like this. Something like that, where I'm using the fifth downwards to start my phrase as well as going up. Just practicing both of them completely changes your phrasing, and it's really important to do that. Which brings me on to the last point, and this is a way we can use intervals that's much, much more complex, but I think is brilliant, and not something I hear anyone talking about on the internet. And that is spacing each phrase with whatever interval you've chosen. So we're going to go back to fourths for a minute, and I'm going to try and wherever I end my phrase, whatever I play, I'm going to start the next phrase a fourth away from that in either direction. So if I end here, I can either go here or here to start the next phrase. And again, we're thinking about negative spacing. We're trying to start phrases with a gap of a fourth between the previous phrase and the next phrase. It sounds something like this. Again, this is a really interesting way of using those intervals, because now I'm really trying to think about how I'm spacing my phrasing. That will sound different if I use fifths. Listen to this next example. Etc. I think I forgot where I was there, so I'm not going to try and continue that one. But you get the idea. The point being is that those two ways of spacing phrases sound much more interesting than maybe just picking the nearest note because you're comfortable with where the nearest note is on the fretboard. So this is much, much more difficult stuff than maybe you've normally considered doing. I would highly recommend getting familiar with it and try all these concepts out, let me know how it goes. I'm really excited to hear from comments and things like that, so make sure you leave one.